Hola, bienvenidos. Buen día, buenos días.
Good morning, welcome.
Yo soy Bruna Santos, la
I
directora
am
del
Bruno
Brazil
Santos.
Institute
I'm the
Present
director
Hoy.
of
Es un
the
privilegio
Brazil
poder realizar
Institute.
este evento
It
tan
is a
importante para
pleasure
nuestra
and a
región hoy.
privilege
Les
to
agradezco
start
a
this
todos por la
very
presencia.
important event for our
Primero,
region. I thank
quiero
all
extender
of
mi
you for
agradecimiento
your presence. Let
a
me
nuestros
express
colegas
my
del
gratitude
MEXCO
to our
Program, al
colleagues
Mexico
from
Institute,
Latin
por
America
su visión y su
program and the
compromiso que
Mexico
han
Institute.
facilitado y nos
Their
reunimos
vision and their support,
para hablar de temas tan
they have
cruciales
enabled us
como
to
es la
approach
paridad de
such
género
a
y la
relevant topic
competencia
as
en
gender
la región.
parity in the
Sin duda,
judiciary
esta
in
semana
Latin
ha aumentado
America. Latin America
significativamente
has increased in a
la
meaningful
presencia
way
en
the
los tribunales
presence of
superiores y
women
la
in the
autoridad
Supreme
electoral,
Court during the
pero
last decade.
aún tenemos
But we still have
pasos largos para dar
steps to be
adelante.
taken
Además de eso,
forward.
eso ocurre
Apart from this,
lentamente gracias a
uh,
nuevas estrategias
this is
y el
happening thanks to the
reconocimiento
fact that
continuado
new
de la diversidad.
strategies do acknowledge the
Hemos
value
podido
of diversity
desarrollar
in the
genuino
judiciary talent
en
for
otras áreas
genuine
además
leadership
del
in
judicial.
other areas apart from
Hoy
the
estamos aquí reunidos para
judiciary.
analizar
We
estas
are meeting
implicaciones
here today
y
to
el
analyze
fenómeno para la
all
igualdad
of
de
these
género y el Estado de Derecho en
elements
América
and
Latina.
gender
Una
parity for
situación
the
que
rule of law
veíamos
in
en
Latin America
2021
in
tener
a situation that in 2021 we have a better situation than during the 90s, but
en
there's
México, la
still
presidenta
room for growth.
nacional,
In
Norma
Mexico,
Alicia
the
Piña, ha
Chief
favorecido
Justice,
la creación
Norma Alicia
de
Piña, has
jurisprudencia
favored
y la
the
igualdad de
creation
género.
of
Y en Panamá,
jurisprudence
6 de los
and
9
gender
de los 10
equality.
puestos en
In
el Tribunal
Panama, of the
Superior
9
son ocupados
positions in the
hoy
Supreme Court,
por mujeres.
they are
Pero
now
aún nos
held
queda
in
un
women's
largo
hands.
camino en
But
recorrer
there's still a long
en
way to
Brasil,
go in
aunque
countries
tenemos
such as
más,
Brazil,
la mayoría de la población
where
es
we have
financiada de mujeres,
most of the
tenemos
Brazilian
un
population
37%
is
de las
integrated by
posiciones
women. We
ocupadas
still
por
have
hombres. Las
77 of
voces
the
que escuchamos
positions
hoy
in men's
ofrecen
hands.
una
The
valiosa
voices that
perspectiva
we'll
sobre
hear
cómo
today will
avanzar
provide us
en esta
a
situación.
valuable perspective of how to move
Esta noche
forward
no solo
by
vamos a conocer los
identifying not
logros, sino
only
también
the
los
steps
desafíos que
achieved,
aún
but
debemos
also the
superar.
challenges to be
A todos los
overcome.
que están acá
I
en Wilson Center
appreciate
hoy
all of
y
you
también
to be here
agradezco
with
a
us
los que
at
están
Wilson
hoy
Center,
vía Zoom
and I
con
also
nosotros.
appreciate those that are
También
joining us
agradezco la
through a
presencia
Zoom
del
call.
embajador de
And
Panamá en
also, I
Brasil, por estar
acknowledge
acá con nosotros.
the
Un honor.
presence of the
Muchas
Panama
gracias. Bueno, les
ambassador for
presento
being with
sin
us.
más
Well,
las
with no further
voces que
ado,
están
let me
con nosotros
introduce the
hoy.
voices that will
Empiezo
be
por
with us
señora
today.
María
Let
Eugenia
me
López
introduce
Arias,
Maria
la
Eugenia Lopez
magistrada de la
Arias,
Suprema Corte de
the
Justicia de
Chief
Panamá.
Justice of the
También
Supreme
por
Court in
supuesto vía
Panama.
online con
Let me
nosotros
introduce
Ana Margarita
online
Ríos Farjat,
Ana
magistrada de
Margarita
la Suprema
Rios
Corte de
Farhat,
Justicia de la Nación.
Justice of the Supreme Court, Mexico.
Muchísimas gracias por estar con
We thank
nosotros.
you so much for
Y
being
Hilary
with us.
Bass,
And
presidenta y
Hilary Bass,
cofundadora del Bass
she
Institute
is
for Diversity and
the
Inclusion. Ella
founder
es
of the Bass
presidenta
Institute
del
for
Colegio
Diversity
Mexicano
and
de Abogados.
Inclusion
Muchas
and
gracias
former
a
president of the American
Tenemos
Bar
para,
Association.
para usted
Let me start with a question for the three of you.
María Eugenia ha
And let me
dado
start with Maria
las
Eugenia,
voces que tenemos, las voces que
then the
tenemos online,
voices that
Ana
we have
Margarita y
online,
Hilary.
Ana
Y después
Margarita
de
and
esta
Hillary.
conversación también me
And
gustaría
then
hacer
we'll start
preguntas
a
a las personas que están
conversation
acá en el Wilson
uh,
Center.
with
Con
Q&A
la
from
presencia
our
de
attendants.
más
With
o
the
menos,
presence of
¿cómo, de
about
qué manera la presencia de más o menos
in which way
mujeres
the presence of more or less women
en
in
alto
the
cargo
judiciary
en
in
los
high
tribunales
positions
afecta el
at
Estado
the
de
High
Derecho
Court
en
does
general?
impact the
¿Qué
rule of law
indicadores
in
subrayan
general terms,
el
and
avance
which
en la inclusión
indicators are
de las
measuring the
mujeres en el
advancement of the
justicia durante la
inclusion
última
of
década?
women within the justice system in the
Mucho gusto estar
recent
acá con
decade.
ustedes.
It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Muy
I
buenos
thank
días
you,
a
Bruna.
todos y
Good
a
day
todas.
to all of you.
Primeramente agradecer
First of all,
a
let me express my
Wilson
gratitude
Center por
to
invitarnos
the
hoy
Woodrow
a
Wilson
tener
Center for inviting
tener un
us
conversatorio
to be able to have a
compartiendo la
dialogue
experiencia
and
que
exchange
tenemos
our
en cada
experiences
uno de nuestros países.
in each of our
Como
countries.
sabemos,
As we
la
know,
igualdad de género no
the
solo es un
gender
derecho
equality
fundamental,
is not only
sino
a
que es
fundamental
uno de
right,
los
but it is
fundamentos
one of the
esenciales
bases
para
that
construir
is
un mundo
absolutely essential
pacífico,
to build
próspero
a
y
world of
sostenible.
peace, a
Sin
prosperous world
embargo,
in a
nuestras
sustainable way.
sociedades históricamente,
Nevertheless,
como ha
our
dicho Bruna,
societies, historically speaking, as
todavía
Bruna
en
has
algunos
mentioned,
países
yet
se
in
mantiene un
some countries,
porcentaje
we
superior de
still have
hombres
a higher
ocupando
percentage of
cargos
men
de
in
toma de decisiones.
decision-making
En Panamá, por
positions.
ejemplo,
In
en
Panama, for
2007
example,
la
up to
participación de las
2007,
mujeres
the
en la
participation of
judicatura
women
era
in the
de
judiciary
50.9.
was of
Hoy, al año
50.9.
2023,
Today, in 2023,
la judicatura es ocupada por
The judiciary is in the hands of women at a percentage of 63.5%. It has been helpful for us not only to adopt all of and adapt all the internal standards for this parity to take place, but also Panama, as a nation state, has developed standards that mandate the board of directors to have a percentage of women almost equal to the percentage of men, or maybe even a bit more. It must be equitable. Now, then, in the judiciary in Panama, as Bruna has already expressed, 9 of the justices, we have 6 women, and 3 of us are government officials that have been in service for over 30 years at the judiciary. This, of course, has enabled us, apart from knowing the system, to uh, identify ourselves with the need of the fact that more women will be in leading positions and also in the judiciary sector. Studies have been conducted that demonstrate that in the legal firms where and the courts where the judge is a woman, the user expresses that they have better attention given to them, that the process is better organized. And I definitely do consider that the important thing is not to appoint more women, but to create an awareness, a consciousness of the fact that women, as I always say, men are our complement, but we are multitask persons. So that is given the different roles that we have to carry out in our daily development of all of the things that we do as mothers, sisters, and all of these roles have enabled us to grow capabilities and skills that allow us to approach more functions in a competitive way. An important element that has also been identified through the different studies is that women are less susceptible of perpetrating acts of corruption. This is really very important. I have some notes that I want to follow. Uh, Another important consideration is the fact that it is considered that when women are implementing law in the judiciary sector, they do it in a more comprehensive way. That is why I believe that women justices from all over the world have to embrace a full commitment in order to keep on increasing this leadership in all of the judiciary branches in the world, because in 2 words, let me say that if we humanize justice, it could be carried out by women in all the competencies and the capabilities and skills that women do have. Thank you very much. Now, we would also like to hear the voices that are joining us through Zoom. So, uh, shall we start with
Sí, buenos días, ¿se refiere a mí?
Justice Margarita Rios Farhat? Yes,
Bueno, pues
the
muchas
floor is
gracias. Estoy
yours.
muy contenta
Well,
de
thank you
participar
very
en
much.
el
I'm so
foro. Saludo
pleased
con
to
mucho
be a part of
cariño a
this
todas las
forum. Let
participantes.
me
Sobre el
greet
tema que nos
everyone
convoca,
here in regards to
¿qué
the topic that has
diferencia
brought us
hay
here today.
cuando estén mujeres
What is the
en
difference
órganos
of having
jurisdiccionales?
women
Pues
participating in the
me parece
judiciary?
fundamental
Well, I
porque
find it critical
estamos
be,
en esferas
because
de la
we
vida
are
pública en
participating
México,
in spheres of the
en donde
public
antes
life
existían
in Mexico
solamente
where
hombres.
there were
Y
only men
la entrada de mujeres
previously.
está
Now, the
haciendo
entry of
una visión
women
distinta de
is
las
now
cosas.
opening up
Y
a
con
new
esto no
vision of doing
quisiera
things.
decir que
With
tenemos,
this, I
y lo
would
digo con
not
mucho
just
respeto, una
overlook
mirada
saying that
rosa o
we
una
have
mirada
a pink
dulce o una
or
mirada
a
más sensible,
sweet
porque me parece que
uh,
son
or more sensitive
caricaturas y estereotipos
point of view, because I think
que
those are
desnaturando
stereotype
cuando
and
una
different
institución o un
perspectives.
organismo
But
va a
when an
poner a niños
institution,
privados bajo
a
una
branch
cobertura
of
de un
the
solo género, a
such
la
as the
abrir a la
judiciary, when
mayor
they have
incorporación
one
de puntos
single
de vista
gender,
distintos,
when they open up to
necesariamente
different points of
ese
view with
conjunto,
different
esa
genders,
institución va a
obviously
cambiar.
the
Y eso es lo
institution
que
will
poco a
change.
poco ha
And
ido
that is
sucediendo
what little
en
by
la
little
mexicana.
has been
Aún es
happening at the Mexican
insuficiente, muy
judiciary. It is
insuficiente,
yet
la cantidad
insufficient,
de mujeres en
highly
altos
insufficient,
puestos de la
the
vida
number of
jurisdiccional en
women
México.
in high positions
Me
in the
parece que
judiciary
no
life in
podemos hablar de un
Mexico. I
50% y
think
un
we could talk about
50% en
50 and
general
50%
en
in
todo
general
el poder
terms
judicial por la
in
cuestión de
all of the
población, pero
judiciary,
distribuidas de
uh,
manera
but
inequitativa
distributed in
según la
not an
jerarquía de los
equitable way
puestos y de las
in
posiciones.
accordance to the
Podemos ir
hierarchy
viendo una
of the
evolución, por
positions.
ejemplo, de
We can see an
1995
evolution since
a
1995
2021,
to
que ha crecido
2021 that has grown
mujeres magistradas,
of
que
women
es un
justices,
paso
which
arriba en la
is
jerarquía
a
judicial respecto
step
de mujeres
in
juezas,
the
que hay además
judiciary
entre magistradas y
hierarchy
jueces,
with
de
women judges.
15%
We
de
have
magistradas en
judges and
1995 a que las
justices.
mujeres en
We have
comparación con hombres,
women
y de
magistrates,
22% de juezas
15 to
en
22%, and
comparación con hombres,
22%
desde
in comparison to
1995.
men
De las
in
magistradas han
dating back to
pasado del 15% al
1995.
21, al
Justices have
21
gone
más reciente.
from
Y
15% to
juezas han pasado
21%,
del 22%
and
al 30%,
women
de
judges from
42
22% to
mujeres
30.
magistradas
Of
en
42
1995, ahora hay
justices in
189.
1995, we have
De 39
189.
mujeres
Of
juezas en
39
1995, ahora hay
judges, women
206.
in
El número ha
1995,
crecido,
now we have
pero como ha
206.
crecido el
Numbers
conjunto de
have grown,
funcionarios
but since
dedicados
the
a la
group of
judicatura
government
federal,
officials
vemos que el
dedicated
porcentaje
to the
de
federal
estos
judiciary,
puestos
we
en
can
la
see that the
justicia judicial
percentage of
sigue
these
siendo muy
positions of
poco.
high level
Hay
of
un
decision
problema
making is
importante
still
que se
low.
vive en la
Now,
Suprema
there
Corte de
is an
Justicia
important
Mexicana
moment that we're
porque
living
somos
in the
cuatro
Mexican
las
Supreme
mujeres,
Court
cuatro
because
de
we have
11
four women,
integrantes
four
de la
of
judicatura
11
mexicana,
members of the
cuatro
Mexican
mujeres
Supreme
que
Court,
estamos en
four
activo
women
en la
that
Corte
are
Mexicana.
actively
Jamás en la historia de
participating at the
México
Supreme
había
Court.
sucedido
Never ever
una
before in
situación.
Mexican history
Y también por primera
such a
vez una
situation was
mujer
present.
presidenta
And
de la
also,
Corte
for the first
Mexicana.
time, we
La
have
Corte Mexicana
a
funciona en
Chief
dos escalas,
Justice of the
el
Mexican
civil
Supreme Court.
penal,
We have
laboral
a
y
civil, a
primera
criminal,
instancia.
a labor, and
Y
administrative
entre 21 y
courts.
22 ambas
And in
salas
20
fueron
and
presididas
21,
por mujeres,
both rooms
porque
were
yo
chaired
presidía
by
la primera
women.
sala en esos años,
I was chairing the first
simultáneamente.
room
También es un momento
simultaneously.
histórico en
It
ese
is
sentido.
also a historic moment
Se
in
está
this regard.
procurando la,
We are
y yo creo que institucionalmente a través de estas políticas, se
institutionally
está
working
procurando
through
que
these
más mujeres
policies to have
logren
more
tener
women
estos puestos
to
de alta
achieve
dirección
this
jurisdiccional
high
a través,
level
por
position
ejemplo,
in the
de concursos
judiciary through
especializados,
having
concursos
expert
especializados,
contests
no, de
that are
concursos más bien dirigidos
they are
donde solamente
directed,
pueden
they are
participar
contests
mujeres.
directed where we can only have
Pero
women
aún así, por
participating.
ejemplo, en el más
But
reciente
even though
convocado para
in the most
magistradas,
recent one
el
called
número
for
de
women
plazas
justices,
ofrecidas
the
para
number of
magistradas
positions open
fue
for
menor o
justices
está siendo menor
was
porque el
lesser
concurso
or
todavía
is
está llevándose a cabo.
lesser because this
Fue
contest
menor
is still under
para
process.
que
It
las
was a
personas se
lesser
inscritan.
number than the
Entonces, eso
persons
nos habla
enrolled.
de que como sociedad
That
todavía
is
nos
testing us
falta.
that as
Las
a
cuotas
society we're
existen,
still
son
missing
necesarias
the
porque sin cuotas entonces
quotas.
la
They are
dirección de las
necessary
instituciones,
because
de
without
los
quotas,
poderes
the
y de las
institutions
judicaturas
of the
no se
different branches
enriquecerían con una
of
visión
power
verdaderamente
will not
plural de
be
la sociedad
enriched
que la
as the
integra.
plural vision
Entonces,
of
las
the
cuotas sí
society
son
that is
necesarias,
integrating it. So
se están
quotas
llevando a
are
cabo,
still
pero el
needed.
problema pareciera
They are
ser
taking
ahora
place, but the problem
social.
seems to be a
Todavía nos
social
falta
problem. We're still
lograr
missing
dirigir
to
o
achieve,
ampliar u
to
orientar
direct,
las
or to expand,
instituciones
or to direct our
hacia un espacio
institutions
social en donde las
towards a
mujeres
social
podamos
level
sentir
where we women
que el
can
hecho de
feel
participar de la vida pública
that the fact
jurídica
of
de México
participating
no
of the
representa un
Mexican
rompimiento
judiciary public life
con
is not
nuestras
breaking
aspiraciones
away
de vida.
from our
Y
life
aquí es
projects.
importante
And
mencionar,
here
por
it is
ejemplo,
important
eso
to
se dirá el
mention,
proponente en un
for
asunto
example,
que
I have
aprobamos en la
mentioned
primera sala,
an issue that was adopted
donde
in our first
pusiera
hall, where
una
the
jueza de
issue
distrito
was
que
in
estaba
regards
disputando
to
la
a
titularidad de su
district
niña
judge that
o
was
la
disputing
pareja, el padre
the
de la niña,
custody
que
of her
era un
daughter with her partner,
funcionario, no
who
fue
was a
oficial
government official.
de
He
la
was not a
judicatura. La señora
justice
era
or a
magistrada.
judge of the
La guardia y
judiciary.
custodia de la niña
She
tenía
was
el
a
varón, tenía el
justice,
padre. Y
and
uno
the
de los
custody was
señalamientos
in the
era
hands of the
que
father.
más gente
And
hacía más
one of the
fiestas
expressions
para
was that
retener a la
he
niña.
had more time
Y
to
la
look
justicia, pues,
after
¿cómo resolvía eso? Porque
her
no era,
daughter.
en donde
How
dijéramos,
can
no era
we
cuestión de
set
tiempo,
jurisprudence
sino, por
of
ejemplo, de
saying it is not a matter of
reeducación,
time,
de
but
calidad
networks
humana
of
y una
support,
serie de
quality
situaciones
networks, then a
adicionales, ¿no?
series of
Yo creo que
additional
ahorita es
situations?
el
I believe
momento en este
that
tiempo,
the
el momento en
moment
el que se está
is now
vislumbrando qué es lo
when
que
we
hace
are
falta. Y todavía
identifying what
encontramos
is missing,
estas
and we
barreras
still find
que
these
pareciera no estar en primera
hurdles,
línea
these
obstaculizándonos el avance,
barriers that
pero
seem
sí
to
están y
be
sí
putting
existen.
obstacles in
Por
our
ejemplo,
steps.
esta
But
situación
we
en
have
donde puede
situations
decirse
like
que
this
no
one
tiene tiempo porque se
where
dedica
they
a
can
una
say that they have
función
no time
jurisdiccional que
because
le
they
demanda
are in a
su tiempo de
judiciary function
dedicación y
that
no
demands
pueden
time and
hacer
dedication.
nada.
That means she cannot
Lo
be a
cual
mother, a full-time
la
mother.
dura
So
confrontación de estas
that
ideas pues
confrontation of this mere ideas in
significarían un
itself would
retroceso a
mean
todas las
a step
políticas
back
públicas
in all
que
of
van
these public
orientadas
policies
hacia
that are directed
enseñar o
towards the
dirigir
fact
a las
of
niñas, desde
uh,
las niñas,
leading and teaching
enseñarles a que
girls
tienen derecho a
from
una
the
vida
very young
profesional
age
plena.
that they have
Entonces, ¿hasta
rights
dónde hay
to
una
have a
línea de
professional,
retroceso?
fulfilling
¿Dónde
life.
empiezan las
So,
barreras?
where do we find
Requeriría un
these
entendimiento distinto
barriers? We
para
need a
poder
different
colocar
understanding
obstáculos
in order
serios
to place
y la
barriers
importancia de que
in
estas
other
cosas mejoren.
positions. And the
Reitero, no es
importance
ver las
of
cosas con
women
ojos de
in the
sensibilidad
judiciary
o
is
vamos
not
a
to
juzgar de
see
color
things
rosa
with a pink
opiniones
view or
subjetivas, sino que
sensitivity.
vamos a
Uh,
pasar,
uh,
digámoslo así, a
but
juicios
we are
institucionales,
going to create
a
institutional
cuestiones que es
adjustments
necesario
to
ajustar
areas
desde horarios
that
para hacer las cosas
needed
bien.
to be adjusted,
Entonces, todavía hay mucho por
such as
hacer,
shifts, for
todavía hay
example,
obstáculos y
timetables.
la
They
judicatura
are
forma
still
parte de la
barriers,
diversidad entera.
and the
Y en esta
judiciary is a
sociedad
part of a
entera,
full
aún
society.
existen
And in this
obligaciones
full society,
constitucionales para
there are
llegar a la
still
igualdad paridad
constitutional
en
obligations
materia
in
electoral para
order
las
to
mujeres
reach
políticas,
parity
pero es
electoral from the
increíble
electoral
cómo
perspective.
a esas
But it is
reformas pasan
unbelievable that
desdobladas en
these
legislaciones
reforms
y
unfold
prácticas de
legislations
partidos
and
políticos y
practices of the
entidades federativas de
uh,
México, en
political
donde hay
parties
visiones
in Mexico where
regresivas
there are
de tratar de
regressive
dar lo
views
menos.
of trying
Entonces, dentro de esa
to
sociedad
give
hay que
the
seguir
very
luchando
least.
y hay que seguir
So we have
abriendo.
to continue
Creo
our
que la
struggle
judicatura,
and
conforme
opening our path.
siempre
I
va
believe that at the
abriéndose
Supreme
hacia
Court, the
reformas que se
judiciary
haga, veo
is
todavía
better
rezagada
represented.
esta
We're opening up our path. I
respuesta
still see a
como
backlog
magistrada
in
en
the
algunos estados
statistical
de la
forces
República con
of
más
women
paridad que
justices,
otros. Por
and in
ejemplo, la
some
Ciudad de
states of the
México
Republic
solamente
with
es casi un
higher
50
parity than other.
51%,
Mexico City has
y hay
50-50%,
otros estados,
but there are
Aguascalientes
other states
55,
such
9,
as
etcétera, que van más
Aguascalientes,
retrasados que nosotros.
Colima, Campeche,
Entonces, sí
that
estamos
have
ante un
are
litigio de
behind us.
albillos y
So it
matices.
is an issue of geographies
Muchísimas
and
gracias,
leaderships.
Ana Margarita.
We thank you,
Ahora
uh,
quiero escuchar de usted, señora
Justice
Hilary Bass, por favor.
Margarita Rios Farhat. Now the floor goes to Hillary Bass.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. I thought I would start by giving you just a quick overview of the picture in the United States. And I think many people look at our Supreme Court with 4 of 9 justices being women. Of course, that's a first and only time in the history of our Supreme Court that we have 44% women on the Supreme Court. But I think that somewhat hides a much more mixed picture when you look at the entire judiciary. As you know, there are 2 different systems in the United States, a federal system and a state system. The federal system is 100% dependent upon presidential appointments. And these are lifetime appointments. So, for example, President Biden in the first 2 years of his presidency appointed 77% women in his judicial appointments. Prior President Trump, in his 4 years, appointed only 23% women. So because of the nature of the lifetime appointments, despite the fact that President Biden has appointed this enormous number of women, his appointments only make up 12% of the entire judiciary. And so it is very slow changing. So the numbers continue to go up, but it will be at this rate, another 20 to 30 years before we have true gender parity in the federal court system. Currently, the numbers are less than 40%. And again, as I say, although they're going up, currently it's about 37%. On the state side, either the electorate or the state governors appoint the state Supreme Courts and the lower court judges as well. And the numbers are not significantly better, typically in the 30s to 40s, but as is the case with Mexico, it is very geographically based. So we have some states with a majority of women on the state Supreme Courts, and we have other states with 0 women on the state Supreme Courts. And again, the numbers have historically continued to go up, but it is a very incremental process, and it's taking years and years to get to true gender parity. So that leaves us with the question, why does it matter? Well, what we know is that research continues to tell us that having a diverse judiciary is important to increasing the public trust and confidence of the electorate in the courts. And this is particularly the case for the underrepresented minorities. If they don't see anyone that looks like them on the court benches, they have less confidence in the legitimacy of the court decisions. And this obviously has a significant impact on the rule of law. We also should consider that when we talk about diversity on the bench, it goes beyond pure gender. So for example, in the United States, and I know this is the case in many other places in the world, for years, many judges came out of the prosecutorial side of the legal practice. So these were people who for years had been putting people in jail for violation of crimes. What we now know is that it's critically important to have a more diverse point of view on the bench. So that includes ensuring that people, for example, who came out of the public defender portion of the bar or private practitioners, these different points of view make a significant difference in the legitimacy that the public places on the decision making. Now, how does having women in larger numbers impact the judicial decision making? Study after study tells us that in fact, when you compare similar types of cases, male judges and female judges, for the most part, rule very, very similarly. Women judges apparently are slightly more lenient on women criminal defendants than the male judges, but across the board, for the most part, the actual rulings are very similar, which again raises the question, well, then maybe it really doesn't matter if we have many more men on the bench than women. And yet what we know is that there are multiple implicit biases that harm women in the judicial system, whether it's the example that you just heard in Mexico of the woman justice who is denied child custody because of a perception that she can't be a full-time mother and therefore custody is given to the father, or cases of sexual harassment and rape where the woman is questioned as to her veracity and whether she invited this kind of attention. We know that women face implicit bias in the justice system every day. And study after study shows us that that bias impacts their ability as witnesses, as litigants, and defendants. So the mere fact of having women in a position of authority, one has to believe, minimizes the negative consequences of those implicit biases. Because I think the studies clearly indicate that women are less likely to buy into some of the biases that you've heard previously described today than men are. But again, in the end, what we know is that women are perceived to be more empathetic, more collaborative, and more likely to build consensus. And certainly in the US system, where the bulk of cases are civil disputes, and only a very small percentage, literally less than 5% of those cases actually go to trial, the vast majority of those cases are resolved during the litigation process, whether through a formal mediation or an informal settlement process. Studies reflect that having women judges who are much more likely interested in pursuing settlement opportunities among their litigants are more likely to guide that process in a way that is going to ensure that the litigants can avoid trial and end up with a resolution that perhaps neither side is happy about, but that they recognize is a voluntary agreement to resolve a dispute rather than the expenditure and time involved in a trial. So there's no question that even if the actual outcome of the opinion is not altered by virtue of the male versus female judge overseeing the matter, having the female judge does have an impact on the history of the litigation. And again, in closing, most importantly, if you don't have confidence in the justice system, it undermines your perception of the rule of law in your democracy. And only if the judiciary reflects in some small way the diversity of the community will the citizenry have confidence in the determinations being issued by that court. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Hillary. Bueno, un punto que trae acá es que además de la paridad de
We
género,
thank you, Hillary. Apart from the gender parity, we know that diversity in terms of other socio-cultural elements and ethnic factors is critical for a judiciary representing branch. In Panama, Madam Chief Justice, and also in Mexico, Madam Justice, how are you approaching this dimension of diversity? Are there initiatives or programs in other levels of the government, of the state, that are specific to promote racial and ethnic diversity? Yes, let me respond that in the Republic of Panama, in the judiciary, we created the unit of access to justice involving gender. This unit is promoting permanently training, constant training, so that we will make no distinction given the ethnic origins. Even in our contest, the judiciary career does not demand to have a percentage of women that will be above that of men. We measure competencies being males or females. There are also specific programs in the Cherokee province where we have approaches with the indigenous communities in order to promote this wish that women have to participate within the different programs, and that it will be clear and understood that though it's been difficult with time and given also distances, because we have far communities, to have the participation of the judiciary branch, where we have achieved that within these communities, women are understanding that there is no impediment in being a woman or belonging to an indigenous community. That will not prevent your involvement in the judiciary. Most of the leading women in these communities are women, and they do have a strong presence and impact within these communities. I don't know if I have responded to your question. Madam Justice, Margarita Rios Farhat, I would like to hear your experience in Mexico. I'm sorry, your microphone is mute. There we go. I'm sorry. I got it. I'm sorry. Well, in regards to this point, Mexico is a very diverse and rich nation. and we have a lot of communities of indigenous origin, Afro descendants, and little by little they're having more and more spaces. Now, within the indigenous communities, they have some kind of a administration of their own where mores and traditions are used in deciding some matters that are not related to legal mandates. They are not paralegal actions or paraconstitutionals, this type of operations or functions. But there is a possibility that within the indigenous communities, they will take in their hands many of the decisions. But in regards to the federal judiciary, there is not a mechanism that will foster, uh, for example, entry exams or tests for judiciary positions for judges, justices, or politicians uh, that will be addressed to indigenous women or women with disabilities when we're referring to, for example, minorities. We don't have them in place as such. I think this is following the evolution of the Mexican society. We're still struggling with the compliance of international conventions of the ILO, the United Nations, regarding indigenous communities and people with disabilities, where legislative measures are taken at the state and national level with the possibility of the potential of having a presence with indigenous peoples and disability persons, where these persons are not consulted about the measure to be implemented and in which way it could be a measure that will generate harmony rather than resistance and how well they'll be received. This is at the national level. As a Mexican society, we are still lagging this disparity. There is, I believe, a plural consciousness in Mexico with a constitutional uh, article in our constitution, but they're still struggling with the effective attention and care to these international conventions. Now, as long as the Mexican society, in all of its actions, will adopt these conventions, this will be shown and reflected within the judiciary. There are no barriers, there are no gaps uh, for members of the indigenous community or people with disabilities, but that does not mean that there are more quick access mechanisms. As a matter of fact, last week we voted at the Supreme Court in Mexico where we were analyzing a bill, an electoral bill in the state of Chihuahua, where those that were uh, challenging the electoral act were minorities. And they were saying in Chihuahua, the legislator is not establishing ways to have access to uh, voting positions for people with disabilities, members of indigenous communities, and even sexual diversity. They are not opening up more spaces. And with this, we're continuing with a discriminating process because it's more difficult for us to achieve these positions. The act was not challenged or dismissed, but we're still considering it. We need to reflect upon it. If we need to open up spaces or quotas for the representation, or this is something that has to do with the sovereignty of the states in the, this is free legislative appointment. In a society, the judiciary will be following the society that it's a part of. I think there's a lot of room for action, but I do not find institutional barriers, but social and cultural, if any. We thank you, Madam Justice. Now I open up a question directly for you, Hillary. We have the dimension of the private sector, which is the idea where we see that the talent market is more equitable and those businesses that are not retaining, promoting, or hiring and retaining women's talent lose a lot. You are a leader that you know so much about identifying the reasons for which women are leaving the business sector before they reach a leadership position. Now, the same happens within the judiciary sector. What is the difference? Which are the factors that you identify here?
Thank you. What we found in our research was that women typically do not have a problem getting the first job out of law school. And this description is not uncommon as far as other professions, whether it's engineering, architecture, accounting, medicine, across the board. Certainly in law in the United States, 56% of the graduating classes are now women. So for law firms who want to hire top talent, they have to have a significant number of women recruits at the initial stages. So there is no problem with gender equality at the first job level. What we found, however, is that at every step along the way, women tend to leave these professions and certainly leave big law in 150% more than men. And the question is, why is that? We did a separate study on women over the age of 50, because these women were oftentimes partners in their law firms, had clients, had a unique expertise, were well-recognized experts in their field. And despite that fact, they were still choosing to walk away. And so the question was, why is that continuously happening? And again, it's not just law, it's happening in medicine and engineering, etc. And what we found is there's not one single explanation, but an inherent implicit bias that women feel among the professions that have a multi-factor cause. So number one, the lack of pay equity. Women historically and to this day continue to get paid less for the same work than men in their same firms. And year after year after year, women perceive that they have to work harder than their male colleagues to get the same level of recognition. Additionally, women perceive that they face bias in the nature of the projects they are given access to and the clients they are given access to. So what that means is the better projects and better clients are saved for the men. And again, the managing partners of these law firms would undoubtedly tell you that they don't believe this goes on. But when you dig down and you look at the process, what you find is that there is inherent implicit bias where there is a perception that women have to prove themselves again and again to get access to the top work and to the top compensation. This is not unlike opportunities for advancement in the judiciary. What we know is that women typically will not advance themselves. And men very often with limited skills will put their name in for promotion under the assumption that they will learn on the job. Women typically will not put their name in for promotion unless they have all the prerequisites under their belt already. And so in many, many different ways, women in part hold themselves back, but more importantly, perceive that it is going to be harder for them to get that promotion, to get that pay raise than for men. And women also perceive that they have a double standard. If they aggressively go after the promotion or aggressively insist on the pay raise because they say, I am not being treated fairly, the reaction, for the most part, is negative. The women lawyers are perceived as being too aggressive, and what we describe in the US as bitchy and not pleasant to deal with. If, on the other hand, they are soft and nurturing and fit the perceived model of the way women should behave, they're not perceived as future leaders. And so women complain about having a double bind of not being able to be aggressive on the one hand without being perceived negatively, but not being perceived as not aggressive enough, which prevents them from being considered for elevation into leadership roles. We find this evidence of implicit bias at every level of the legal profession. And it includes things such as sexual harassment, which still continues to be an issue, perhaps less open and notorious as it was 20 years ago, but still perceived by women to impact their ability to be successful, whether it's because of networking opportunities that happen in men's clubs and playing golf, where women feel excluded, to the more obvious cases of bias, where women are not asked to join the men at lunch or to join the client in an after-hours activity. So these types of biases impact women's perception and their reality as far as their ability to achieve true success in the practice of law. And time and again, what they tell us is that at some point after 20 years of going through this exercise, they throw up their hands and they say, it's just not worth it. Now, the good news is that study after study reflects that women love the practice of law. They love the intellectual challenge. They love the challenge of solving their clients' problems. So it's not the practice of law that women end up turning away from. It's all the bureaucracy of dealing with inherent bias in the legal system that turns women off and eventually has them leave the profession.
Muchas gracias, Hillary. Bueno, pregunta a la audiencia que está acá en el Wilson Center. Si
We
tiene...
have questions here at the audience. Is there any question? I have a question here in the first row. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. My name is Roberta Laju, and I'm from Mexico. I want to ask the Justice Rios Farhat, how do you feel that it will impact women and men, the current battle that you're having in the judiciary in Mexico, where all of the funds, the trust funds, have been limited, where they are putting judges in a vulnerable situation, giving the way of life, where they have to defend in areas where we have narco trafficking present. Don't you feel that these attacks, these legal reforms that have just been approved by the Mexican Congress, are putting women and the judiciary at stake in Mexico? Thank you very much. Well, I thank you for your question. Well, when we have less funds, less resources within an institution, we can perceive a complicated scenario. But as you mentioned, it is a legal reform. And given the fact that it is a legal reform and I take my job very seriously, I could not express myself along this line. I have to analyze the standards, their merit, because that is my responsibility. I can give you a broad answer, but every time the funds or the budgets are limited for an institution, the institution limits its scope. If this is impacting institutional capacities or perhaps in their project, perhaps when a budget is limited within an institution, they have to limit projects, for example, implementation, training, numbers that you had considered to expand some activities. This is something that is understandable. It has to do with how to be creative in order to move forward. And this has to do with how the Supreme Court has to make any comment if this is the case. I have another question here and another one in the back. Yes, good day. My name is Claudia Escobar. I am a Guatemala judge. I am in exile in the United States for the past 9 years. I have a question for Maria Eugenia Lopez in regards to the issue regarding ethics in the judiciary function regarding women. The issue in Guatemala, we have women in the judiciary in high positions such as the Attorney General, the Chief Justice, but nevertheless, They are agreeing their principles with a corrupt system. The Attorney General has been considered as an anti-democratic, given acts of corruption. And well, this system where women are in charge has started a persecution against judiciary government officials that have had important roles in our fight against corruption. How can we promote in a way that women that come into power will act appropriately and that they will not become part of anti-democratic and corrupt systems as it happens in many of our countries that are led by people that are authoritarian? Thank you. I thank you so much for your question. Well, for me, the first thing that we have to consider as a part of keeping this ethical behavior is values, ethical values. Let me be redundant in saying this, that people do have. In Panama, we have an integrity and transparency court that started its operations just a little while ago, that considers all of the ethical infringements of judiciary workers, being men or female or women, regardless of this condition. Yet, how can we promote the fact of being ethical? That is an issue that has not only to do with professional training. Yesterday, I was sharing where we are at this moment and why our societies are so sick. And they are so sick because values have been lost, ethical values have been lost that should be accompanying each and every one of us, and that they should be a part of us since we're growing up, since our early childhood. All of us, we had an upbringing in our homes and guidance from our parents that taught us what is correct and what is not correct. I feel that we have lost the fact of being able to have the right conversations, of reinforcing each other, of supporting each other, because quite often there are people that fall into situations of forgetting their principles given a personal circumstance, a social circumstance that they are enduring or living through. But beyond this, I consider that it is within ourselves to continue promoting these values. If we do not promote a culture, a world of peace, a peaceful world, and perhaps an important issue has to do with judiciary independence, which is highly important from my perspective. And we have a judiciary career adopted since 2015. Yet it is not until 2021 or 2022 that we open up calls for judges and magistrates positions open. And of course, this judiciary career, to be in a position through a contest process, is what will give this uh, judge or women justice or men justice, will allow them to take decisions independently and following the facts that are presented to their understanding through a process, through a legal process, and not to respond given the fact that our constitution states that the three branches of the state of Panama, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary sector, are independent, yet they act in a harmonious collaboration. Yet it cannot be interpreted that this collaboration would mean that I have to access to a request of any of the other two branches of government that are of political nature, because the legislative and the executive branch are political bodies. The judiciary body is not a political body, therefore it should not respond to political pressures. And I think it is quite appropriate to highlight here that even the function that the president of Panama has to appoint the justices of the Supreme Court in the case of the current executive or president of Panama, 5 of the 6 appointments that he has made were the result of a public call, a public open call, where we had to be subject to a public interview. Given the state covenant in favor of justice, we were subject to psychometric testing. Then we had an interview with the president, and we didn't know him before. So I believe one has to acknowledge good things and also identify negative things. The president, even all of this, he said, these 5 women, of all the scrutiny that has been done, I believe that they are the ones that I am to appoint. And I don't know if I said this during my first intervention, but 3 of us have been within the institution for over 30 years, and we have demonstrated an institutional commitment and an integral trajectory, an impeccable trajectory. So the judiciary branches have been impacted given the fact that the judiciary receives a budget decided by other body of the state. But even though this could have something to do for them to say, well, I have to give up, but I believe that if we do not understand that we're not to give up, whatever price needs to be paid for it, and we become stronger, we will achieve independent judiciary branches. It is up to us to fight in order to achieve this goal. I thank you so much. We have one last question. I thank all of you for your presentations. I find them very interesting. And I have 2 questions. The first question is for Hillary, because I think that this dynamics that you're telling us about of how within the working centers we replicate the gender structures, such as these structures that are not explicit, but the fact of being invited to a luncheon, or activities beyond your working spaces are dynamics that also take place within the legislative, the judiciary element. And I wonder how lawyers in the education, how we can make it explicit within the training centers, the education centers, the law schools, which are critical for what will happening later in our working positions. And my other question is for Margarita Rios Farhat. I'm thinking about the case that you were mentioning about this judge that had a problem regarding the custody of her daughter with her former partner. And the question is, at what time is it uh, good to accept other models of parenthood? At what moment we have to recognize that it is possible to recognize that women will give a priority to their career, and motherhood should not mark our professional trajectory. And I ask this myself because that is like aiming to family models where women are not the primary caretakers, and how we're turning this into something more socially acceptable.
Well, I'd be happy to start by addressing that. And this is certainly something that the American Bar Association puts out materials on, that we do training sessions for law firms, for law students. It's something we talk about across the board. But to your second point, what we know is that women lawyers who become mothers, 46% of them tell us that it impacts the quality of the work that they get thereafter. So once again, there is an implicit bias against mothers that they somehow cannot possibly be as committed to the workplace as they were the day before they gave birth. And what we know is that there's no factual support for that. In fact, the vast majority of women have children, take time off, and come back to work full time, and are just as productive, oftentimes just more efficient, being more productive in less time than their male colleagues. And yet, this is once again one of those biases that we have to address on a societal basis. The fact that women are capable of having productive careers and being good mothers, and that one does not prevent the other. And I always look to the point of, no one says to a man who has just become a father, well, now that you're a father, you can't possibly be as committed to the workplace. Well, if you asked a father what was more important to them, their family or their job, I suspect they would give you the same answer as most mothers, which is nothing is more important than my family and my children. That does not prevent me from being a productive lawyer. And so one can only hope that the younger generation, where many of the men have a very different view of parenthood, where they want to be more involved and are prepared to take on more responsibility, will slowly have an impact on this societal view that it's only mothers whose productivity is impacted once they become a parent.
Bien, por lo que toca a la pregunta, servidora
In regards to your question, well, I think that your question is quite interesting and quite a current question. At what moment are we going to consider new parental perspectives or life projects and parenthood? I think this is so open that this is the way it has to be recognized, but it's still a very personal decision. Every personal decision has to be recognized. The example of the district court judge is because she wanted to have the custody of her daughter. It was part of her life project, but in her life project, it was not to suppress motherhood, which is highly respectable, of course, not at all. Her life project was to incorporate her daughter. And why should I be quarreling and measuring my professional success from a woman that is deciding in the high level, because that is going to impact my individual project? And there is a problem here that we still face as women, as gender, because the idea that we're permitting within the institutions in the public decision-making spaces is precisely to adapt all of these actions and measures and adjust these models that were originally excluding, and to place them at a state where women with a life project or with an alternative development or sexual diversity will not find any barriers, but they will find access. What is happening is that if we decide to change an institution, basically the judiciary, or call it the government, the academia, a legal firm, is becoming difficult. And what happens is that we get involved, but the inertia, the institutional, cultural inertia that dates back decades is so strong that ends up actually taking away the ways of working, and we try to adapt by peering our lives and supporting other women, and it's becoming difficult. That is why I believe that we women that are in the decision-making position of the public and the private sphere, we are women that we act in a decisive manner, because we come from fighting for access of a space that, in order to achieve it, in general terms, perhaps it has been much more difficult for us than our male partners, because it means to consider your life projects, what is expected from us, from our parents, our relatives, our family members, our boyfriends, etc. And apart from this, we have to adapt to an institution that has historically followed a development under a male vision. And I'm not saying this in a diminishing way, but in a historical way. This judiciary has been integrated mainly by men. So this vision of we women being involved, little by little, historically, into the decision public spaces, it is also not something that has deprived us of participating in these decisions, but something that is critical, which is to learn how to work among ourselves. There are now stereotypes that we women do not collaborate among themselves, where the only thing that has been missing is the time, the decades have been used to work among ourselves, and among ourselves, talking about different dimensions without generation breakings of with young and adult women. I believe that we are healing this situation, but it's still present. And if you allow me, I am the result of this. I wanted to follow the judiciary branch 30 years ago. It was not possible. Then I was in a firm law, and I was very happy. Then I had another crystal roof. First, I had problems. First, because I was going to get married and I was going to become a mother. We need to learn how to sail. But let's say if you're a sailor and you're looking to achieve the fulfilling of your life, not to have a divorce of your professional and personal life, that is because we're highly determined women in what we want to do. What is important is that wherever we're at, we have to join more women, which is difficult given this inertia of finally placing ourselves, and it's quite complicated to move the institutions and the organization of all of these institutions in such a way that this is scaring women away from not willing to continue. They can be a part of other professional spaces. And then it is complicated for us as women to achieve that our involvement within institutions, within the decision-making processes of any level, to achieve that this involvement will be redirecting with sensitivity, with accessibility, an institution or an organization. I believe that the inertia and the strength of the institutions and organizations is yet strong, but we are many women that are still embracing this battle for this to take place and become a reality. Well, we appreciate Justice Riaz Farhat, and we appreciate having heard you, Hillary, uh, Justice Riaz Farhat, and Chief Justice Lopez Aria. We thank you for all of these core issues regarding democratic institutions, the rule of law, Mexico Institute, and the Brazil Institute of the Wilson Center. And we highlight a lot the Latin American program and the Mexico Institute regarding gender violence within the region. So let me express my gratitude to all of you for having joined us in this conversation.